When we're writing our memoir scenes, we tend to focus on the content of what we're putting down on the page, the description, the action, the dialogue, and so on. But we can also think about, after we got that draft done, about pacing. So pacing is simply the rhythm of the sentences. We don't want to have a monotonous rhythm. We want to have a flow that's appealing to the sound that the reader hears when they're comprehending your sentences. This is something you do later. Don't do this during the early editing stage. Do this in the later revision stage. But your readers will appreciate that sound. In the same way a poet focuses on the sounds, the rhythms of the sentences, you can also focus on that in your prose. So I've put up a paragraph on the screen here about a grandma. So the author is, coming to see them. The grandma's sick, dying. But let me read it out loud and you'll see what I mean by a monotonous rhythm here and how we can fix that. Grandma's room had always been on the first floor. I knew where Grandma's room was. I walked towards a small room with 2 wide windows and 1 wooden door. The room smelled of medicines. Grandma lay on her bed with her back towards me. Grandma had white hair. I walked to the side of her bed and managed to say, "Grandma." Grandma turned to look at me. Her face was pale and full of wrinkles. She was sick and I could feel it, with tears in her eyes and a smile, and this should be a smile on her lips. She came forward and took me in a tight hug. Grandma felt weak and smelled of strong medicines. My uncle walked into the room. Greeting me, he said, "She doesn't have a lot of time." I felt scared. So you can see there's not a lot of variation there in the structure of these sentences. I only see a couple of sentences where they're a bit longer and they change the pace a bit. Let's run through this and see how we can tighten it up a little and maybe add a little variation here so it's not always the same sentence structure. One thing I noticed when I was reading it, and it's always really good to read your work out loud, is room, 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 room. So when I was reading that, it felt a little too repetitious there. So we may want to combine this. Grandma's room had always been on the first floor. I'm not even sure we need to know I knew where Grandma's room was, like the reader doesn't care. I walked towards her small room with 2 wide windows and 1 wooden door. The room smelled of medicines. Later, we're going to get the strong medicines again, so I'm not even sure we need to have that in the paragraph. So I would just remove that. Grandma lay on her bed with her back towards me. Grandma had white hair. You could say something like, instead of starting with grandma all the time, you could say, "I saw her white hair. I walked to the side of her bed," and I don't know about managed to say, just say grandma, maybe like make it a question. She turned to look at me. And here we've got 2 sentences that are kind of short. You could say something like, she turned to look at me. Her face pale and wrinkled. So let me reread that. She turned to look at me, her face pale and wrinkled. See, I've kind of varied the sentence structure there. She was sick and I could feel it. I'm not even sure I would keep that. You're showing that she's sick in this later on in the paragraph. So I might even just totally delete that, but I'll just leave it for now. I do think that could be I felt it. With tears in her eyes and a smile on her lips, that should be a comma there. She came forward. I would say that's a weak verb. I would say she leaned forward and took me in a tight hug. Maybe there's a shorter way of saying this, but I'll just leave that. Grandma felt weak. So I guess that's from the hug. And smelled of strong medicines. I would just say medicines. My uncle then walked into the room. And I'm going to change this. See, we got 2 sentences there. My uncle walked into the room, period. Greeting me, he said she doesn't have a lot of time. So let's add some variation there. My uncle then walked into the room and greeted me saying she doesn't have a lot of time. And then we can always put the period inside the last quote. And I don't mind this final sentence. It's a nice punctuation mark almost for the whole paragraph, as I felt scared. So let me read that again. Grandma's room had always been on the first floor. I walked towards her small room with 2 wide windows and 1 wooden door. Grandma lay in her bed with her back towards me. I saw her white hair. I walked to the side of her bed and it should be said, "Grandma?" She turned to look at me, her face pale and wrinkled. She was sick, and I felt it. With tears in her eyes and a smile on her lips, she leaned forward and took me in a tight hug. Grandma felt weak and smelled of medicines. My uncle then walked into the room and greeted me, saying, "She doesn't have a lot of time." I felt scared. So the way I read it there, you probably saw there was a little more variation. Some sentences are a little shorter, some are a little longer. It has almost a poetic rhythm. And that's the kind of thing you can do near the end of the revision process to create a more appealing sound of your sentences for readers.